This is one of the most important and terrifying documents published in our time. It is the case submitted by South Africa in the International Court of Justice, and it accuses Israel of genocide. Now, what is so chilling about this document is that it reads as though you are somehow reading a great crime from the past, as it seeks to explain how this monumental horror was made possible to a public which is astounded that such an atrocity could ever have been tolerated at the time. But this is happening now. Right now, as I speak and as you listen. Now, this is an extremely important point to make. In genocides in the past, there is often a historical debate later on about how much people knew at the time, and therefore how complicit they were, and whether this mass slaughter could have been stopped sooner. It's therefore our responsibility to make sure everyone does know about the mass extermination of Palestinians currently taking place in Gaza, so there are no excuses, no places to hide, and so pressure can be brought on our governments to end their complicity. That's because Western governments continue to back and arm Israel, making them directly complicit and partly responsible for one of the great crimes of our age, and the Western media has largely sought to hide the reality of this horror from the public. You either have media outlets which act as overt cheerleaders for the Israeli military, or other outlets which frame this ongoing crime as Israel seeking to eliminate Hamas with a side debate, or whether its so-called response is proportionate, where we can all agree to disagree, that it's a subjective opinion one way or the other. But this isn't about proportionality at all. This document squarely accuses Israel of genocide, noting both intent and conduct. Now, I've read this 84-page document, and to be clear, South Africa is not messing around here. This is an extremely serious piece of work, which hugely able legal experts have clearly spent a massive amount of time and resources on. It is lawyerly, it is detailed, it is obsessively evidenced. Indeed, there are 574 footnotes scattered throughout. Now, you may think, like myself, that you may have been closely following Israel's war crimes since the atrocities committed against Israeli civilians during the attack by Hamas and other armed groups on the 7th of October last year. You will still find this document absolutely shocking if you have humanity, partly because of the details you won't have been familiar with, partly just because finally everything has been put in one place, or rather everything up to the point this document was written. Every day brings new examples, both in terms of conduct, that is, genocidal acts against the Palestinian people, and in terms of intent, that is, statements by Israeli politicians, officials, journalists, and others endorsing genocidal sentiments. Now, the document focuses, in its words, on acts threatened, adopted, condoned, taken, and being taken by the government and military of the State of Israel against the Palestinian people, a distinct national, racial, an ethnical group in the wake of the attacks in Israel on 7th of October 2023. It makes clear South Africa's own condemnation of war crimes committed by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups that day. A critical point it makes is this: no armed group, no armed attack on a state's territory, no matter how serious, even an attack involving atrocity crimes, can, however, provide any possible justification for or defense to breaches of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This couldn't be more important to state. Even if, for example, we were to start the clock on October 7th and erase decades of mass ethnic cleansing by Israel, occupation, land theft, illegal colonization, apartheid, the mass slaughter of innocent civilians, Palestinians, including 240 alone this year in the West Bank before October 7th, even if we were to erase that context, which we must not do, there is never any justification for the crime of genocide, as the document puts it, whether as a matter of law or morality. It further notes, the acts and omissions by Israel complained of by South Africa are genocidal in character because they are intended to bring about the destruction of a substantial part of the Palestinian national, racial and ethnical group, that being the part of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip, that is, the Palestinians of Gaza, as they're referred to throughout. It makes clear Israel is violating the Genocide Convention by failing to prevent genocide and committing genocide. and that includes failing to prevent or punish the direct and public incitement to genocide by senior Israeli officials and others. This is the case the document seeks to prove. It also understands genocide as a continuum, which is how Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who coined the word genocide in 1944, wanted us to understand it. That means placing the current horror in a broader context of a 75-year-long apartheid, a 56-year-long belligerent occupation of Palestinian land, and a 16-year-old blockade of Gaza, bearing in mind that Gaza before this was legally understood to be under Israeli occupation because of Israel's total control over land, air, sea, of what got in and what got out, and all the crimes associated with all of those things. Now, it notes numerous warnings by UN officials and others for world leaders to take responsibility to prevent genocide, and that therefore South Africa and other signatories of the Genocide Convention have a responsibility to act. Now, genocidal intent comes from statements by Israeli state representatives, including those at the very top, the Israeli president, the prime minister, the Ministry of Defense, and others. Intent is also referred from the nature and conduct of Israel's military operation in Gaza, as it puts it, from its murderous armed assault on Gaza to depriving the population of the necessities of life and humanitarian assistance, including failure to provide or ensure essential food, water, medicine, shelter, and other humanitarian assistance, to the destruction of the healthcare system. It notes how before this horror began, Gaza was already left vulnerable by Israel to humanitarian catastrophe because of the siege, describing it as the indefinite warehousing of an unwanted population of 2 million Palestinians, leading to de-development and de-industrialization, with a 40% unemployment rate, a 60% poverty rate, and 80% dependent on some form of international assistance, with the coastal aquifer, the sole source of natural drinking water, polluted and unfit for human consumption because of contamination by seawater and sewage, and a healthcare system that was already on its knees. It also notes numerous examples of the mass killing of Palestinians in previous onslaughts, including the mass killing and maiming of peaceful protesters. Now, in the here and now, the document discusses the key facts about Israel's military campaign against Gaza by land, air and sea, that by 29th of October alone, that's many weeks ago, 6,000 bombs per week had been dropped on a narrow strip of land approximately 365 square kilometres big, one of the most densely populated place on earth, home to 2.3 million, nearly half of whom are children, making it one of the heaviest conventional bombing campaigns in the history of modern warfare. In just over 2 months, the attacks have caused more destruction than the razing of Syria's Aleppo between 2012 and 2016, a much longer time frame, Ukraine's Mariupol, or proportionately the Allied bombing of Germany in World War II, again over a much longer time frame. The destruction had left Gaza with a different colour and texture when looked at from space. It notes the huge death toll, which according to the NGO Euromed Human Rights Monitor, including those buried under the rubble who aren't included in the official death toll, that means now more than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, mostly women and children. Now, paragraphs 43 to 100 of this document concern genocidal acts committed against the Palestinian people in Gaza. It notes the challenges in establishing the facts on the ground because of Israel's imposed telecommunications blackouts, for example, the restriction of access by fact-finding bodies and international media, and the mass slaughter of Palestinian journalists who've been killed at a rate significantly higher than in any conflict in the last 100 years, with an average of one journalist dying every day, representing more than 73% of the total number of journalists and media workers killed globally in 2023, bearing in mind that this horror began only in the last quarter of that year. Nowhere is safe. Palestinians are killed, it notes, in homes, places they sought shelter, in hospitals, in UN schools, in churches, in mosques, as they seek food and water for their families. They are killed if they fail to evacuate. And in the places that they fled, they are killed too, and while fleeing along what Israel declared as safe routes. There are growing reports of Israeli soldiers summarily executing Palestinians, including multiple members of the same family. In one cited case in Gaza City, at least 11 male members of the Annan family and their relatives, boys and men, were reportedly shot dead in front of their families before the women and children were then attacked. There's also reports of unarmed people, including Israeli hostages, of course, being shot dead on sight, despite posing no threat, including when they were waving white flags. So-called dumb, unguided bombs are reportedly dropped by Israel on Gaza in huge numbers, as well as heavy bombs weighing up to 2,000 pounds, with a predicted lethal radius of up to 360 metres, but able to cause severe injury and damage up to 800 metres away from the point of impact. Around 1 in every 100 Gazans are now believed to have been killed because of violent deaths, and nearly 1,800 Palestinian families are estimated to have lost multiple family members. Hundreds of multi-generational families have been killed in their entire bloodlines, wiped off the face of the earth, with no remaining survivors at all. Mothers, fathers, children, siblings, grandparents, aunts, cousins, all gone. Entire families, often killed together. In the first month of this horror, 312 families had lost over 10 members each. The level of mortality is such that medics in Gaza have coined a new acronym, WCNSF. Wounded child, no surviving family. Over 115 Palestinian children are killed every day, as well as doctors, journalists, teachers, academics, and other professionals being killed at wholly unprecedented rates. Indeed, it's estimated over 311 doctors, nurses, and other health workers, including doctors and ambulance workers on duty, have been killed. 40 civil defence workers, those are those who dig victims out of the rubble and then are killed themselves, killed on duty. Over 209 teachers and educational staff also killed. 144 UN employees have been killed, the highest number of aid workers in UN history in such a short time. As well as violent deaths caused by Israeli military, Israeli weapons, Palestinians are at immediate risk of death by starvation, by dehydration and disease, as well as the ongoing siege, the insufficient aid allowed in, and the extreme difficulties in distributing that limited aid given the destruction of Gaza's infrastructure. Over 55,000 Palestinians have been wounded, mostly women and mostly children, and that often means burns and amputations, with an estimated 1,000 children losing one or both legs. With only 13 out of 36 hospitals partly functional and no fully functioning hospital left in North Gaza, the healthcare system has all but collapsed, and injured people are reduced to waiting to die, often dying slow and agonizing deaths. Even before this onslaught, Palestinians suffered severe trauma from prior attacks, with 80% of Palestinian children suffering high levels of emotional distress, 79% demonstrating bedwetting, 59% showing reactive mutism, 59% engaged in self-harm, and 55% with suicidal thoughts. The current horror will only have made that so much worse, not least for the tens of thousands of Palestinian children who've lost at least one parent. For me, this following sentence chilled me to the bone. The report says this: for the families who remain intact, or partially intact, it's about doing everything you can so your child doesn't realise that you've lost control. There's something particularly devastating, I feel, about reading that sentence. Palestinians, according to this report, based on its evidenced readings of what's happening, Palestinians are subjected to cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, with large numbers of civilians, including children, reportedly arrested, blindfolded, forced to undress and remain outside in cold water before being forced onto trucks and taken to unknown locations. 85% of the population, it states, have been expelled from their homes. That is 1.9 million out of 2.3 million, with nowhere safe to flee to. Repeated evacuation orders combined with the total siege, described by the Red Cross as incompatible with international humanitarian law, with the World Health Organization warning it could be tantamount to a death sentence for hospital patients, and often Palestinian children are ordered into areas where there are ongoing airstrikes, creating terror. People flee to areas supposedly that are safe, which are then bombed. Growing population density as they are forced into an ever-shrinking corner of Gaza render these Israeli strikes ever more lethal. The forced evacuation, it notes, is necessarily permanent for many Palestinians because 60% of the entire housing stock in Gaza has been destroyed, with the